They tried to put my land under their HOA. And for a while, I honestly thought I was the crazy one. Like maybe I'd missed something. Maybe I didn't understand how these things worked anymore. But then I found the clause, and that's when I realized they hadn't just made a mistake. They'd built their entire expansion on something they legally couldn't touch. And the moment I understood that, everything shifted. My name's Daniel Harper, and I own about 200 acres of timberland just outside a place called Ridgeway Hollow, a quiet stretch of western Tennessee that used to be nothing but farmland, logging roads, and the kind of silence you don't notice until it's gone. My family's had that land since my grandfather bought it in the late 70s, back when nobody wanted it because it wasn't good for crops, too rocky, too uneven. But it was perfect for timber, and over the years, we learned how to work it right. Not fast money, not flashy, just steady cycles. Plant, grow, thin, harvest, repeat. The kind of rhythm that teaches you patience whether you like it or not. By the time it came to me, it wasn't just land, it was a system. Contracts with regional mills, management plans filed with the state, tax classifications that only applied if you followed the rules down to the letter. I wasn't just owning woods. I was operating a working timber property, and there's a difference there most people don't understand until they try to mess with it. For years, nothing much changed. You'd hear a truck maybe once every hour on the county road. Neighbors waved when they passed, and the biggest excitement was whether we'd get enough rain that season. Then one summer, things started shifting, slow at first, like background noise you can ignore. Survey flags showed up along the southern boundary, bright orange ribbons tied to stakes that hadn't been there the week before. Then came the clearing, machines cutting through what used to be open pasture, pushing dirt into neat rows like they were ironing the land flat. Within a couple months, there was a sign up near the highway, polished wood, big letters. Cedar Ridge Estates, a master plan community. I remember standing there in my truck the first time I saw it, engine still running, just staring at that sign like it had personally insulted me. Not because I was against development. I mean, land changes, that's just reality, but because I knew what followed those words. Roads, utilities, fences, and eventually, rules. At first, though, everything stayed on their side. They built clean, I'll give them that. Paved roads went in, drainage systems looked solid, houses started going up one by one. All of them with that same polished look, neutral colors, trimmed lawns that seemed to grow overnight. It was organized, controlled, almost too controlled. My neighbor, Old Man Curtis, who owned a smaller patch just east of me, used to joke about it whenever we ran into each other at the feed store. He'd lean in a little, lower his voice like he was sharing state secrets, and say, "You watch, Dan. Those folks don't build neighborhoods, they build rules." I'd laugh it off at the time, but he wasn't wrong. The first real sign something was off didn't come from them knocking on my door or putting up a fence. It came from a piece of mail. Thick envelope, formal letterhead, addressed to adjacent property owner. Inside was a packet, promotional at first glance, glossy pages showing walking trails, community parks, little diagrams of future phases labeled in soft greens and blues like it was all already peaceful and decided. But buried in there, mixed in with all the friendly language, were phrases that didn't sit right. Future integration opportunities. Extended community planning zones. Stuff that sounded harmless if you skimmed it, like marketing fluff. But I've been around contracts long enough to know that the words people gloss over are usually the ones that matter most. So I didn't skim. I sat at my kitchen table that night, coffee going cold next to me, reading every page slow, then reading it again, and that's when I saw it. Not in bold, not highlighted, just tucked into a section labeled Covenant Expansion Provisions. A clause referencing adjacent parcels, not just acknowledging them, but including them as part of a future controlled zone intended to preserve visual continuity and land use standards. I remember actually saying it out loud, just to hear how it sounded. Including adjacent parcels. Including mine. Now, here's the thing. They hadn't stepped onto my land, hadn't filed anything directly against my deed, hadn't even contacted me. On paper, it looked like nothing more than forward-looking language, the kind of thing developers use to keep options open. But the intent was there, clear as day once you slowed down enough to see it. They were planning for a future where my land wasn't just next to their development, it was part of it. Not owned, but controlled. And control, when it comes to land, can be just as powerful as ownership, sometimes more. I didn't react right away, didn't call them, didn't send a letter, didn't storm into some office demanding answers. Instead, I did what my grandfather used to do whenever something didn't feel right. I went quiet, and I started digging. Next morning, I drove into town, stopped by the county records office, and requested everything tied to Cedar Ridge Estates. Not just the marketing material they'd mailed out, the real filings. Zoning approvals, infrastructure permits, subdivision maps, HOA covenants, the stuff that actually matters when things go sideways. The clerk behind the counter, a woman named Lisa who'd probably seen every kind of land dispute imaginable, gave me a look when I told her what I was after. Not suspicious, just knowing. Like she'd seen this story start before. You building or defending? She asked, half smiling. I paused for a second, then said, haven't decided yet. She nodded like that was answer enough, printed out a stack of documents thick enough to feel like a warning, and slid them across the counter. Start with the covenants, she said. That's usually where the interesting stuff hides. She wasn't kidding. I spent the next 2 days going through those documents line by line, marking sections, cross-referencing maps, checking how everything connected, and most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Clean approvals, standard language, nothing out of place. If anything, it was well put together, professional, thorough, the kind of plan that moves through approvals without much resistance. Except for that one piece. That same clause, expanded, formalized, tied into their long-term development phases. It didn't claim my land outright. That would have been too obvious, too easy to challenge. Instead, it set the groundwork for influence, architectural consistency, land use expectations, visual standards, all extending outward, beyond their current boundaries. They weren't grabbing land, they were shaping it. And that's when I felt it. Not panic, not even anger yet, just a slow, heavy realization settling in my chest. They hadn't made a careless mistake. They'd made a calculated move. And they were counting on nobody noticing, or nobody understanding it well enough to push back. I leaned back in my chair that night, documents spread out across the table, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge, and I remember thinking, all right, if this is the game they're playing, then I need to figure out what rules they forgot. Because with land like mine, there are always rules people forget. And sometimes, that's exactly where things start to fall apart. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because I was worried. Not exactly. It was more like my brain wouldn't let go of it, kept circling back to that clause, turning it over from different angles, asking the same question in a dozen ways. What did they miss? Because I knew they had missed something. They had to. People that careful don't just slip language like that into a filing unless they think they're covered. And if they thought they were covered, then whatever gap existed, it wasn't obvious. So I went back to the one thing I understood better than anything else in that situation, my own land. See, most folks hear timberland, and they picture trees, maybe some logging equipment, a dirt road or two, but what they don't see is the paperwork behind it, the structure that makes it function. My property wasn't just sitting there growing wood, it was registered under a state forestry management program, tied into long-term yield plans, environmental compliance requirements, and tax agreements that only stayed valid as long as I followed very specific rules. It's a system designed to protect working land from being treated like empty space, and in return, you agree to operate within its framework. And buried in that framework was something I hadn't thought about in years. I pulled out an old binder from the shelf in my office, one of those thick, worn ones you keep meaning to organize but never do, flipped past harvest schedules, inspection reports, renewal forms, until I found it. The management agreement. Original copy, signed and filed when the land was first enrolled. I sat there reading it slow, finger tracing the lines like I was trying to feel something hidden in the ink, and then I hit it. A clause I'd skimmed 100 times before without really needing it, because nothing had ever pushed against it. No external entity may impose land use restrictions that materially interfere with registered timber operations without initiating a full regulatory compliance review under state authority. I read it again, then again, and this time, it landed different. Because that's exactly what their HOA language was trying to do, not directly, not aggressively, but structurally. Architectural standards, visual consistency, land use expectations, those aren't suggestions once they're embedded into a covenant system tied to a development plan. They become enforceable conditions, and if those conditions extend to my land, Even indirectly, they're imposing restrictions. Which means they'd triggered the clause. And the clause didn't just protect me, it forced a process. I leaned back, let out a slow breath, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I smiled. Not because I'd won anything yet, but because I finally understood where the pressure point was. Now here's where most people would have gone straight into confrontation, call the developer, threaten legal action, make noise. But noise gives people time to prepare, to adjust, to fix things before they become a problem. I didn't want them fixing it quietly. I wanted it locked in place exactly as it was. So instead of going after them directly, I went after the system they'd already submitted themselves to. A couple days later, I was back at the county office, but this time I wasn't just pulling records. I was filing something. Not a lawsuit, not a complaint, a notice. Formal, documented, tied to the regulatory body that oversees land use compliance for registered timber properties. Lisa was there again. Same counter, same knowing look. Only this time she glanced at the paperwork in my hand and raised an eyebrow. "Guess you decided," she said. I slid the documents across. "Yeah, I'm defending." She scanned the first page, eyes moving a little slower when she hit the section referencing the HOA covenant language. Then she looked up at me, and there was a hint of something different there now. Not just recognition, but interest. "Well," she said, tapping the paper lightly, "this is going to make some people's week a lot more complicated." "That's kind of the idea," I replied. What I submitted was simple on the surface, documentation showing that Cedar Ridge Estates, through its recorded covenants, had established language attempting to regulate land use on an adjacent parcel classified under protected timber operations, my parcel. That alone was enough to trigger a mandatory review. Not optional, not delayed, mandatory. And once that process starts, it doesn't care about construction schedules, marketing timelines, or investor expectations. It follows its own path, its own pace, and everything tied to the affected development plan has to wait. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The crews kept working, houses kept going up, trucks still moved in and out like nothing had changed. If you didn't know what was coming, you'd think it was business as usual. But behind the scenes, things were already shifting. About 2 weeks later, I got the first sign. A letter, official, stamped, addressed not just to me, but copied to the developers, the county planning board, and the HOA legal representatives. Notice of review initiation. Scope of concern clearly outlined, potential conflict between HOA-imposed land use expectations and protected timberland classification. I didn't have to imagine their reaction. I could see it. Conference rooms, papers spread out, someone flipping through documents faster than they should, another person saying, "Wait, when was this added?" And someone else answering, "It's been in there from phase 1. Because that's the thing, they couldn't just point to it and say it was a mistake. It was filed, approved, integrated into the structure of their development. They owned it. A few days after that, I finally got my first direct contact. Phone call. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Daniel Harper," I said. A pause, just long enough to feel intentional. "Mr. Harper, this is Michael Brenner with Brenner Development Group. I believe we're neighbors." His tone was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that's used to closing deals, smoothing over concerns, keeping everything friendly on the surface. "Depends how you define neighbors," I said. A small chuckle on the other end. "Fair enough. Listen, I think there may have been some misunderstandings regarding our development filings. We've been made aware of a notice you submitted, and I'd really prefer we handle this directly, without unnecessary complications." There it was, the first attempt to contain it. "I read your filings," I replied. "Seemed pretty clear to me." Another pause, shorter this time. "Well, the language you're referring to is standard forward planning terminology. It doesn't impose any immediate restrictions, and certainly not on your property." "Not immediate," I said, "but it's there." He shifted slightly. I could hear it in the silence. "Even so," he continued, "we're more than willing to clarify that language, make adjustments where needed. There's no reason this has to escalate." I looked out the window while he was talking, trees stretching out past the edge of the yard, steady, unmoved, and I thought about how easily this could have gone unnoticed, how, 5 years down the line, that clarified language might have turned into something enforceable. "It already has escalated," I said. "You filed it." That was the first crack. Not loud, but real. He didn't argue right away. And when he spoke again, the smoothness was still there, but thinner now. Mr. Harper, Daniel, these processes can slow things down for everyone involved. Contractors, buyers, families waiting to move in. I'm sure that's not what you want. There it was, the pressure angle. I let that sit for a second. What I want, I said finally, is for my land to stay exactly what it is. And right now, your paperwork says otherwise. Silence. Longer this time. Then, quieter, more direct. What would it take to resolve this? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of how fast the conversation had shifted from misunderstanding to negotiation. Nothing, I said. You already set the process in motion. Now it plays out. That was the moment he realized this wasn't something he could smooth over with a call. You're willing to stall an entire development over wording? He asked, a hint of edge slipping in. I leaned back in my chair, voice steady. I'm willing to let your wording do exactly what it does. And just like that, the line between us was clear. We hung up not long after that. No agreement, no resolution, just an understanding that neither side was stepping back. Over the next few weeks, the impact started to show, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, telling ways. Permits for future phases stopped moving. Inspections took longer to schedule. Sections of cleared land sat untouched, equipment idle longer than usual. Curtis noticed it before I said anything. We were leaning against the back of his truck one afternoon, watching the distant movement over by the development, or rather, the lack of it. They slowing down? He asked. Looks like it, I said. He squinted toward the site, then glanced at me sideways. You got something to do with that? I shrugged just a little. Maybe they read their own paperwork too late. He let out a low whistle, then grinned. Told you they build rules. I nodded, watching the stillness where there used to be constant motion. Yeah, I said quietly. This time, the rules built them back. And the thing is, it wasn't over yet. Because what they were about to find out was that fixing a mistake like that isn't as simple as deleting a sentence. Not when that sentence is holding up everything behind it. By the time they realized how deep the problem actually ran, it was already too late to make it quiet. That's the part people don't really understand about paperwork like this. Once it's filed, approved, and tied into active development, it stops being flexible. It's not just a document anymore, it's a foundation. Every permit, every lot sale, every promise made to a buyer, it all leans on what's written in those filings. And if you pull one piece out, the whole structure has to be checked again. That's exactly where they found themselves. At first, they tried to move around it, little adjustments, internal revisions, meetings that stretched longer than they wanted. You could see it in the way the site changed, not dramatically, but enough if you were paying attention. Fewer crews, equipment sitting still in the same spot for days, materials delivered, then untouched. Then came the notices, not the ones I received, theirs. Requests for clarification, compliance reviews, requirements to address conflicts between recorded covenants and protected land classifications, each one small on its own, but together they stacked up into something heavier, something slow. And slow is the one thing developments like that can't afford. I got a copy of one of their revision proposals about a month into the review. Not directly from them. They never reached out again after that call, but through the same public channels where all this started. They were trying to remove the language, clean it out, strip any reference to adjacent parcels, including mine. On paper, it looked simple. Delete the clause. Move on. But it doesn't work like that. Because that clause wasn't just sitting there by itself. It was woven into their entire plan. It connected to design standards, future phases, shared infrastructure concepts, even marketing materials that had already been used to sell early lots. Removing it meant more than editing a paragraph. It meant unraveling everything it touched. And once you start unraveling something like that, you don't get to stop halfway. They had to resubmit everything. Updated plans, revised covenants, new compliance checks, fresh approvals from the same boards that had already signed off once. Except now, those boards were looking at the project differently. Not as a clean, forward-moving development, but as one that had already triggered a regulatory conflict. Weeks turned into months. And that's when the real pressure set in. I started hearing things, not directly, not in some dramatic confrontation, but through the kind of quiet channel small towns are built on. The guy who delivered gravel to both my road, and there's mentioning delayed payments. A contractor at the diner one morning complaining about projects getting tied up in red tape. Even Lisa, one afternoon when I stopped by to pick up unrelated paperwork, shaking her head slightly as she stamped a document. "They're still in review," she said. "Figured," I replied. She glanced up at me, just for a second. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" I thought about that, about the moment I found the clause, about the decision to file instead of call, about that phone conversation with Brenner. "I knew it could," I said. That was the truth. Not certainty, just understanding. Out on the edge of my property, the trees kept doing what they've always done, growing, steady, unaffected by any of it. I walked the same paths I had for years, checked the same markers, planned the next thinning cycle like nothing had changed, because for me, nothing had. But just beyond that boundary, everything had. Sections of land that were supposed to become new phases stayed empty. Roads that had been graded led nowhere. Buyers who had signed early contracts were waiting longer than expected, and waiting, when you're dealing with homes, turns into questions real fast. I drove past the entrance to Cedar Ridge Estates one evening, sun dropping low enough to stretch shadows across the pavement, and I saw something that stuck with me. The sign was still there, polished, confident, but behind it, the motion was gone. No trucks, no crews, just quiet, not abandoned, but paused. And there's a difference. A few days later, I ran into Brenner. Not planned, just one of those small-town collisions you can't avoid forever. Gas station off the highway, late afternoon, only a couple pumps in use. I was finishing up when a black SUV pulled in, clean, expensive, out of place in a way that didn't try to hide it. He stepped out, saw me almost immediately, and for a second, neither of us said anything. Then he walked over. No phone voice this time. No distance. Just two people standing on cracked pavement with the smell of gasoline in the air. "Daniel," he said. "Michael." Up close, he looked different. Not weaker, not defeated, just tired in a way that doesn't show up in meetings. "We've submitted the revisions," he said after a moment. "Full removal of the adjacent parcel language. Clean break." I nodded. That's what the notice said. He studied me for a second, like he was trying to figure out if there was something he was missing, some angle he hadn't accounted for yet. "This didn't have to go this way," he said. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed loosely. "You wrote it that way." A small exhale, not quite a sigh. "You could have called," he added. "We would have fixed it." I shook my head just a little. "You would have adjusted it," I said. Quietly. Before it mattered. That one landed. He didn't argue, just looked off toward the road for a second, jaw tightening slightly. "You understand what this cost?" he asked, not aggressive, just direct. I met his eyes. "Yeah," I said. "Do you understand what it would have cost me if I didn't catch it?" Silence again. But this time, it wasn't tense. It was honest. Because that's the part nobody likes to sit with. There wasn't a villain here in the way people want there to be. He wasn't trying to steal my land outright. He was building something, pushing boundaries the way developers do, seeing how far the system would let him go. And I was protecting something that doesn't grow back the same once it's been reshaped. We just happened to meet at the line where those two things collided. He nodded once, slow. "Fair enough," he said. Then he turned, walked back to his SUV, and drove off without another word. That was the last real conversation we had. A couple months after that, the final decision came through. The revised plan was approved, but only for the original phases that didn't rely on the extended covenant structure. Everything beyond that, the expansion they'd been building toward from the start, was effectively cut off. Not banned, not denied outright, just left without a path forward under the current framework. And without that path, it never moved. The land they'd cleared for future lots stayed empty. The roads ended where they ended. Cedar Ridge Estates remained, but smaller than it was meant to be. Contained. As for my land, nothing changed. The trees kept growing, contracts stayed in place, management plans rolled forward like they always had. If you walked it today, you wouldn't see any sign that any of this ever happened. No markers, no scars, just rows of timber moving through their cycles like time hadn't been interrupted. And maybe that's the strangest part of all this. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. No lawsuit headlines. No dramatic shutdown. No big public fight. Just a development that quietly stopped expanding. Because of one line. One clause that wasn't supposed to matter. I still think about that sometimes, how close it came to going the other way, how easy it would have been to ignore that packet, skim those pages, trust that standard language meant harmless. And I wonder how many places out there are already shaped by things like that, decisions made in quiet rooms, written in careful words, waiting for nobody to look too closely. So here's what I'm curious about. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Would you let it play out, knowing it could stall something that affects a lot of other people, families, workers, buyers? Or would you have picked up the phone, tried to settle it quietly, maybe find a middle ground? Because from where I stand, I didn't stop their project. I just let their own rules do what they were always going to do. But I know not everyone sees it that way. So tell me, was that fair? Or did I go too far? I'll be reading the comments.